scattered all over the balcony floor. It wasn't the wind or an accident. Someone had done it on purpose. While I was picking up the remains of years of hard work, I found a white envelope among the broken pots. Inside, there was a flyer from Thompson Properties talking about a bright future for the neighborhood, along with an offer to buy my apartment for way above market value. The next morning, other residents were talking about similar envelopes. Mrs. Harrison was especially on edge, her hands trembling as she showed me the letter she'd gotten. "William, they've been doing this for weeks. Some neighbors have already sold," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. On my way to work, I noticed a guy in a suit taking pictures of the building. When he realized I was watching him, he quickly got into a black car and drove off. That same afternoon, I got an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was blunt. "Mr. Mitchell, accidents happen. Your garden was just the start. Take the offer while it's still on the table." That night, while I was trying to fix what was left of my garden, I realized this was bigger than just random vandalism. The whole building was under attack, and for some reason, they decided to start with me. But they didn't really know me. I'm not the type to be easily shaken. The intimidation grew stronger in the following weeks. My mailbox started getting fake eviction notices, and somewhere someone was tampering with my car's brakes. Luckily, I'm a mechanic and caught it before I could drive off. The creepiest part was finding photos of me going to and from work inside my mailbox. They were watching me. During a condo meeting, I found out that I wasn't the only target. Other residents. That garden was my safe haven, my little win in the middle of all the city's craziness. Every morning, before heading off to the auto shop, I'd spend a few minutes watering the plants that turned my balcony into my own little oasis on the third floor of this 1930s Art Deco building. I've been living here for 12 years, and every little corner of this apartment carries a piece of my story. The tools neatly arranged on the custom shelves, the smell of coffee filling up the kitchen bright and early at 6 every morning, and of course, my vertical garden. A setup that took months to plan and build with the same precision I used to fix the most complicated cars. Mrs. Harrison, my 78-year-old neighbor, always says my garden brought new life to the building. Little did she know that those plants would spark a battle I never imagined I'd have to fight. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this. It was on a Tuesday that everything started to fall apart. I got back from work and found my vertical garden completely wrecked. The metal frames were twisted, the plants ripped out and reported similar incidents, but most were too scared to do anything about it. That's when one name kept coming up. Robert Thompson, the developer behind Thompson Properties. I started digging into him and his company. Online, I found several articles on urban revitalization and modernizing historic areas. Every one of them followed the same pattern. Old buildings were torn down to make way for fancy shopping centers. Robert Thompson was always there, smiling next to local politicians. One day, after coming back from the shop, a guy approached me. He introduced himself as James Walker, a representative of Thompson Properties. His expensive suit didn't match his intimidating attitude. "Mr. Mitchell, why make things difficult? Everyone's got a price," he said, upping the previous offer significantly. When I refused, Walker's tone shifted. He mentioned how tragic it would be if something happened to the building, a fire maybe, or sudden structural problems. That's when I noticed another man watching our conversation from across the street. Older, classy, with an air of authority. Walker caught my glance and smiled. "Mr. Parker is very interested in this project," he said before leaving. That night, after digging a little deeper, I found out that Benjamin Parker was more than just an investor. His name appeared in several controversial developments, always under various company names. In every case, historic buildings would mysteriously have accidents or be condemned due to sudden structural issues. The pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about a greedy developer wanting to build another shopping center. Something bigger was in play. A well-orchestrated scheme to wipe out the city's historic heritage. And somehow, our building was the next piece of that puzzle. I decided to look closer into Thompson Properties. At the municipal library, I went through years of construction permits and public records. A pattern emerged. Every project by the company started with the acquisition of historic buildings that, coincidentally, soon had accidents or were condemned. During my research, I noticed a young employee from Thompson's office who always appeared at inauguration events but was never mentioned in the news reports. Sarah Cooper. I found her name under photo captions. There was something about the look in her eyes in recent pictures, a kind of barely hidden discomfort. I got her contact through a friend at the shop who knew someone working in the same building. After several tries, Sarah agreed to meet me at a cafe outside the downtown area. "I can't stay long," were her first words, eyes constantly checking the door. What Sarah revealed confirmed my suspicions and then showed something even worse. The project wasn't just a shopping center. It was part of something called the Heritage Center, a mega development plan meant to turn the whole historic neighborhood into a complex of luxury commercial and residential buildings. "Mr. Parker isn't who he claims to be," Sarah whispered, sliding a flash drive across the table. "His name isn't even Parker, it's Anderson. He has a history of real estate fraud in other cities. Thompson is just a puppet, the public face of the operation. Anderson is the one really calling the shots." On the flash drive, I found emails and documents showing how Anderson, using different identities and shell companies, had systematically trashed the historic heritage of 3 other cities. The scheme always followed the same steps. First come the threats, then the accidents, and finally the demolition, all covered up with forged papers and bribed public officials. It was even more disturbing to learn that our building was special for them, being one of the last genuine examples of Art Deco architecture. Its demolition would set a precedent for tearing down other protected historic structures. It was the key piece for the whole Heritage Center project. Sarah also mentioned suspicious meetings between Anderson and members of the Historic Preservation Board. "They're planning something big for the next few weeks," she warned as she abruptly got up. "Be careful, William. Anderson is not someone you want as an enemy." Before she left, Sarah gave me one last crucial detail: a list of owners of historic properties who had resisted Anderson's plans in other cities. Some had suddenly moved away, others had suffered mysterious accidents. 2 had disappeared completely. On my way home, I realized I was being followed. A black car, the same one I'd seen taking pictures of the building weeks earlier. I managed to shake it off using my knowledge of the quieter streets in the area. But one thing was clear: my investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. That night, I organized all the information I'd collected. Every document, every photo, every connection pointed to a conspiracy much bigger than I initially thought. It wasn't just about saving my apartment or my garden anymore. It was about stopping the systematic destruction of our city's history. The next morning, James Walker showed up at my shop. This time, there was no smile or friendly offer. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Mitchell," he said, leaning against the car I was fixing. "Mr. Anderson isn't happy with your excessive curiosity." I kept working on the engine, pretending not to notice when he let slip Parker's real name. "You know what happens to mechanics who can't keep their hands clean?" Walker continued, grabbing one of my tools. "Work accidents are pretty common in this line of work." I kept my cool, even when he purposely dropped the tool on the engine. "Tell your boss I also have some interesting information about him," I shot back, finally looking him in the eye. "It'd be a shame if the press found out about your other business deals in other cities." "Anderson." Walker's face changed right away. For the first time, I saw worry in his eyes. He left the shop making vague threats, but I knew I'd hit a nerve. That same afternoon, I noticed some shady activity around the building. Men in uniforms from a construction company started doing inspections all over the building. Mrs. Harrison saw them tampering with the electrical box in the basement. Hours later, we began having intermittent power issues. The next day, the main plumbing showed mysterious leaks. It was obvious what they were trying to do: create structural problems to justify condemning the building. But they never counted on my experience. Years of fixing cars had taught me a lot about electrical and mechanical systems. That night, I secretly fixed the problems they created during the day. Things hit the fan when they tried to sabotage the old building elevator. I found its cables partly cut during one of my late-night checks. Had I not discovered it, someone could have been seriously hurt. I installed discrete cameras at key spots in the building, waiting to catch the saboteurs in action. Then I got a disturbing call from Sarah. "William, Thompson is missing," she said, her voice shaking. "He found out something big about Anderson and now no one knows where he is. I think they might have done something to him." That night, Walker showed up again, this time at my apartment door. "Last warning, Mitchell," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside were photos of me talking with Sarah at the cafe, and more of her coming and going from work. The message was clear. They knew who was helping me. "It'd be a shame if something happened to Miss Cooper," Walker smirked. "Young employees tend to disappear all the time in big cities, don't they? Just like some real estate developers." I slammed the door in his face, but his words hit me hard. They'd gone too far now. Not just property threats, but threats against people. Sarah was in danger for helping me. Thompson was missing, and I was probably next. I had to act fast. The evidence I'd gathered so far wasn't enough to take down someone like Anderson. I needed something more solid, something irrefutable. And from what Sarah said about Thompson discovering something important, maybe he was the key to all this. I needed to find Thompson before it was too late. Sarah sent me his home address, and on a rainy night, I decided to check it out. The apartment was a mess. Drawers open, papers scattered everywhere. Clear signs of a rushed search. In his office, I found an embedded wall safe, partly open and empty. Among the scattered papers, I discovered notes about a Cayman Islands account and references to a specific deposit. Thompson had been gathering evidence of money laundering. On his password-protected computer, I managed to crack an encrypted file named Anderson Heritage. After years of dealing with car diagnostic systems, I had enough know-how to break the protection. The file revealed a much bigger scheme. Anderson wasn't just knocking down historic buildings. He was using them as a front for an international money laundering operation. Every development was financed with questionable funds, turned into shiny, seemingly legitimate investments. When I got back home, I noticed lights on in my apartment. Someone had been in. I climbed up the emergency staircase, and through the kitchen window, saw two men ransacking everything. I quietly snapped photos of the invasion. One of them was Walker. I decided not to go in. They were probably after the flash drive Sarah had given me. The next morning, I got an anonymous message with GPS coordinates and a time. It just said, "If you want to help Thompson, come alone." It was risky, but I had no choice. The spot was an old abandoned industrial warehouse in the port area. I arrived half an hour early, checking out the perimeter. That's when I saw Thompson being dragged inside the warehouse by two men. He was alive, but looked pretty beat up. Using my mechanic skills, I managed to get in through a maintenance passage on the roof. From above, I witnessed a disturbing scene. Anderson himself was interrogating Thompson about some missing documents. "Where's the proof of the transfer?" he was shouting. "You think you can blackmail me? I built this empire." Thompson, even though he was injured, stood his ground. "Everything's stored in a safe place," he replied. "If anything happens to me, everything goes straight to the feds." I recorded the whole conversation on my phone. Anderson was confessing not only to money laundering, but also to the demolition schemes and the threats. That's when one of his goons noticed some movement on the roof. I had to move fast. Using a screwdriver I always carry, I loosened part of the metal structure on the ceiling. The noise and falling pieces created the perfect distraction. In the chaos, Thompson managed to break free. I jumped from the mezzanine, knocking one of Anderson's men down. In the middle of the chaos, we managed to escape through a side exit. But when we were almost at my car, we heard gunshots. Thompson got hit in the shoulder. I dragged him into the vehicle and sped off. "The safe in the bank," Thompson murmured, clutching his wound. "Account 247. The password is the Heritage Center's inauguration date." His face was going pale. I had to take him to a hospital. But first, we had to grab those documents. With them and the recording I just made, we'd finally have enough proof to take down Anderson. With Thompson bleeding on the passenger seat, I made a risky call. I rang Sarah while driving. "I need you to grab something from the bank for me, now." I gave her instructions as I weaved through traffic towards the nearest hospital. Sarah managed to retrieve the documents from the safe deposit box just minutes before Anderson's men reached the bank. Meanwhile, I left Thompson in the ER under a fake name and sped away. Anderson would definitely send people to the hospitals looking for us. I met Sarah at a 24-hour cafe. The documents were even more damning than we expected. They had detailed records of bribes, fraudulent contracts, and best of all, proof that Anderson was using money from international criminal organizations in his projects. "We need to hand this over to the feds right away," Sarah said. But before we could leave the cafe, Walker and two guys barged in. We managed to slip out the back, but in the escape we lost the folder with part of the documents. We ran through dark alleys with the rain starting to fall. Sarah tripped, and one of the men almost caught her. I used my screwdriver to puncture the tire of their car, parked nearby. The sound of the tire bursting gave us a few more precious seconds of advantage. We split up. It was safer that way. Sarah took the flash drive and part of the documents, and I had the recording from the warehouse plus the rest of the evidence. We agreed to meet the next morning at the federal police station. I went back to my apartment to grab some important stuff, only to find the place completely destroyed. On the walls was a clear message: "You have nowhere to run." My vertical garden, which I'd already rebuilt, was in ruins again. I decided to hide out in the shop. While I was sorting through the remaining documents, I heard a noise at the back door. It was Mrs. Harrison, pale and breathless. "William, they're in the building. They're putting something in the basements. I think it's explosives." My heart froze. Anderson had decided to end everything at once. With explosives in the basement, they could easily stage a gas leak or a sudden structural failure to justify demolishing the building immediately. And if there were casualties, it would be all the better for their plans. I dialed the emergency number Sarah had given me, a federal agent who was secretly investigating Anderson. "We've got less than an hour," I warned. "They're going to blow up the building." I ran back to the building with Mrs. Harrison. The residents needed to be evacuated quietly, without alerting Anderson's men. Using the old intercom system I'd modified, I managed to warn each apartment one by one. As the families slipped out quietly through the back, I saw Walker and his men coming out of the basement. They noticed our suspicious movement and started looking for the source of the leak. Time was running out. Then I heard sirens in the distance. A lot of sirens. Sarah had done it. The federal police were on their way, but Walker heard them too. I saw him running back toward the basement, probably to set off the explosives early. I couldn't let that happen. Our historic building, with memories of so many families, couldn't end like this. I chased after him, knowing I was about to do something extremely dangerous. But sometimes, you gotta risk everything to save what really matters. The basement was dark and damp when I went in. I heard Walker tinkering with something in the deepest part of the area, where the old meters were kept. Using my knowledge of the building, I crept up quietly behind the old pipes. "It's over, Walker," I said, making him spin around quickly. He was holding a detonator. "The feds are almost here. Anderson's done for." "You don't get it, Mitchell," he replied, his finger hovering over the button. "If this building goes down, all the physical documents still at Thompson's apartment will be destroyed. It'll be your word against ours." The sirens grew louder. Walker nervously glanced toward the stairs. "Anderson has judges, politicians. You really think a few pieces of circumstantial evidence will bring him down?" "That's why I made copies of everything," I shot back, stepping forward. "Every document, every recording is backed up in multiple secure places. If something happens to this building, everything goes straight to the press." It was a bluff, but it worked. I saw doubt flash across his eyes. The sound of doors being forced open on the upper floor echoed through the building. The federal police had arrived. Walker made a sudden move for the detonator. I didn't think, I just acted. After years of playing baseball in high school finally paid off, I hurled my heavy wrench with all my might. It hit his hand at just the right moment. We wrestled on the basement floor. Walker was stronger, but I knew every nook and cranny of that place. I managed to pin him against an old pipe just as the federal agents stormed down the stairs. "William Mitchell," one of them asked as they cuffed Walker. "Sarah Cooper told us everything. Thompson is also cooperating from the hospital. Anderson and 3 members of the Historic Preservation Board have just been arrested." Climbing up from the basement, I saw the first light of day streaming in through the lobby windows. The building was still standing, majestic in its Art Deco style. My vertical garden would need to be rebuilt for the 3rd time, but that was the least of my worries. I looked at Mrs. Harrison, who was crying with relief as she hugged the other residents. Our home was saved, and more importantly, the history it held was going to live on for generations. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this. 3 months later, the Anderson case made national headlines and sparked investigations in other cities where he'd operated. A huge corruption network involving dozens of politicians and businessmen was exposed. Thompson, after recovering, became a key witness in the process. Not only was our building preserved, it even received the status of a specially protected historic landmark. The story of the residents' resistance and the unearthing of the criminal scheme caught the eye of preservationists all over the country. Now, we became a symbol of the fight to save our urban memory. Sarah left her job at Thompson Properties and started her own historic preservation consultancy. She often visited me at the shop to talk about other endangered historic buildings. Her knowledge of the corporate world and my hands-on experience made for one unique partnership. Mrs. Harrison organized a party on the roof to celebrate our victory. My vertical garden, rebuilt for the last time, was more lush than ever. The building's kids even helped plant new saplings, and each family adopted a piece of the garden to take care of. "You know, William," Mrs. Harrison said while we were serving cake to the residents, "when you moved in, I thought you were just another young guy who'd soon be gone. But you've proven to be the heart and soul of this place." The sun set over the city, casting golden hues on the Art Deco buildings. From the roof, you could see other historic buildings that were also saved after Anderson's downfall. The Heritage Center was never built. and in its place, restoration projects began to bloom. I received several invitations to give talks about historic preservation and sustainable urban development, but I preferred sticking to my auto shop, fixing cars, and taking care of the building. Sometimes, the biggest victories are found in the little things of everyday life. On a quiet afternoon while watering the garden plants, I spotted a new shoot pushing up among the debris from the latest destruction. It was a rare kind I'd thought was gone forever. Like our building, it had survived every attempt at destruction, proving that some roots run too deep to pull out. The city kept on growing and changing, but now there was a newfound respect for its past. And in our little Art Deco building, with its vertical garden and its tight-knit community, history kept on living and blooming day after day. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this.